I found the little prayer card tucked inside the folded bathroom towel on a Tuesday morning in November, and before I even read the words printed on it, something in my chest went still the way a house goes still before a storm finds it. It was one of those small laminated cards, the kind handed out at funerals, with a verse from Psalms on one side and a name on the other. The name on it was my late husband Raymond's name, Raymond Allen Graham. And it had been folded so small, so deliberately small, tucked so deep inside the white terry cloth, that I knew it had not fallen there by accident. Someone had hidden it there the way you hide something you need to keep close but cannot afford to be seen holding. I want to say something before I go any further. I am 77 years old, and I have lived long enough to know that the stories that matter most are rarely the ones that announce themselves with noise. The story I am about to tell you is not a news report. It is not a confirmed case or an official document. It is a story that grew out of months of quiet observation, a mother's particular kind of attention, and one night inside a bathroom that changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about my family. The names and details are part of the telling. But the feelings behind this story, the guilt and the grief and the particular silence of a daughter who has been slowly disappearing, those are things I believe many mothers will recognize before I even finish the first few minutes of telling it. My name is Loretta Graham. I am 77 years old, and I have lived in the same house on Fairmont Ridge Avenue in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, for going on 31 years. The house is a two-story colonial with cream-colored siding that needs repainting every decade or so, and a front porch that catches the afternoon light in a way that made my late husband Arthur stop and stand still sometimes, just to feel it on his face. Arthur passed 4 years ago, a slow cardiac decline that gave us time to say everything that needed saying, which I am grateful for, even now. The grief never fully leaves, but it changes its shape over time, and most days now it sits quietly in the corner of whatever room I am in, rather than filling the whole space the way it did in those first months. I live alone in this house, which my children consider both my stubbornness and my right. I have 2 daughters and a son. My son David lives in Pittsburgh with his wife and their 3 children, and we talk on the phone every Sunday. My younger daughter, Patricia, moved to Phoenix 9 years ago and calls more than she visits, which suits us both well enough. And then there is Natalie. Natalie Ann Graham, 31 years old, dark-haired and serious-faced since she was about 12, the child who always read more than she talked and who cried at bird documentaries when she was small and thought none of us could see her doing it. Natalie had been living in a rental on the other side of Harrisburg for several years, close enough to visit on a Sunday afternoon, far enough to have her own life separate from mine. She had a good job doing something with databases and technical systems that I never fully understood, but always asked about, because asking mattered even when the answers floated over my head. She had a small apartment with good light and a cat named Bertrand that she spoke about the way some people speak about their dearest friends. She was not dramatically unhappy. She was not falling apart in any visible way. She was simply Natalie, quiet, competent, a little guarded, and always carrying some private weight that she rarely let anyone see. I want to tell you about Colin Mercer before I tell you about the night everything changed, because understanding that night requires understanding him first. Colin had been part of our family's outer orbit for almost 12 years. He had been a friend of Arthur's from the church's men's fellowship group, one of those reliable background figures at holiday dinners and birthday gatherings who carried boxes, filled plates, remembered how people took their coffee, and never made a fuss about anything. After Arthur passed, Colin continued showing up. He helped me understand the insurance paperwork. He drove me to a medical appointment when my car was in the shop. He sat with me at the kitchen table more than once while I cried about nothing specific and everything at once. He was 62 years old, widowed himself 7 years prior, and everyone in this family treated him the way you treat a piece of furniture that has always been in the corner. Present, familiar, assumed to be harmless. I trusted him completely. I want you to hold on to that fact because I am going to need you to understand it fully before this story reaches where it is going. Before I continue, I want to take a small breath here and ask you something. If you are listening to this story right now, would you do me the kindness of telling me where you are? What city? What state? What country? What time it is where you are sitting? I started telling stories because I was lonely after Arthur died, and I found that loneliness gets easier when you know someone is on the other end of your words. If this story is already settling somewhere in you, leave a like. Subscribe if you want another story tomorrow. I put one here every day because there is always more to say. Now let me go back to what I was telling you. The changes in Natalie began so gradually that I almost convinced myself they were not changes at all. The first thing I noticed was the phone calls. Natalie had always called on Wednesdays, not because we had ever formally arranged it, just because that was the pattern we had fallen into over years. Wednesday evenings around 7, she would call, and we would talk for 20 or 30 minutes about nothing significant and everything quietly important. Around the beginning of last year, those calls began thinning out. First, she missed one and sent a text message saying she had been tired. Then she missed 2 in a row and called on a Saturday instead, but she sounded different. Shorter sentences, quicker pauses. The kind of voice a person uses when they are managing something privately and do not want it heard. I told myself it was work stress. I told myself she was adjusting to something. I told myself I was reading too much into telephone silence. The second change was her appetite at family dinners. Natalie had always been the one at the table who came back for second helpings of whatever I had made, the one who asked for the recipe even though she never cooked it herself, the one who stayed at the table talking long after everyone else had drifted toward the living room. Sometime around early spring, she started eating less, not dramatically, not in a way that alarmed anyone else at the table. But I noticed. I noticed these things the way mothers notice them, not because we are trained to, but because we have been watching the same person eat at the same table for over 30 years, and we know exactly how much they usually fill their plate. She also started arriving late and leaving early. She used to be the last one out the door at family gatherings, hugging everyone twice, standing in the driveway talking even after she had already said goodbye. Then suddenly, she was the first to gather her keys, the first to look at the clock, the first to find a reason to leave before dessert. She always had a reason. Work in the morning, an early appointment. She was tired. She had to let Bertrand out. The reasons were reasonable. That was what made them so difficult to question. The third change was the hardest one to name because it was not a behavior exactly. It was more of a quality, an absence of something. Natalie had always had a way of looking at me directly when I spoke to her, this very particular kind of attention that I had always taken as both her gift and her character. She was a listener, my Natalie. She looked at you when you talked. Somewhere in the middle of all this, she stopped doing that. When I spoke to her, she would look slightly past me, toward the window, toward the floor. Not rudely, not dismissively, but the way a person looks past you when they are carrying something too heavy to put down long enough to give you their full eyes. I said nothing about any of this for weeks. I watched. I made mental notes. I told myself I was probably imagining it, that I was a widow woman of 77 with too much quiet time and too much tendency to see trouble where there was only ordinary life moving forward without me. Then I found the prayer card. That Tuesday morning in November, I had gone into the hallway bathroom on the second floor to replace a bar of soap and refresh the towels before Patricia came up for a weekend visit. I pulled the folded white towel from the shelf inside the linen closet, and the card fell from inside it onto the tile floor. I picked it up the way you pick something up when you expect it to be a receipt or a small grocery list, casually, without expectation. And then I read the name. Raymond Allen Graham. Raymond was Arthur's middle name, Arthur Raymond Graham. Nobody called him Raymond. Nobody except Natalie. When Natalie was small, she had gotten it into her head that calling her father by his middle name was a private code between them, a secret joke, and it became the name she used for him when she was being tender with his memory. She was the only person alive who called him that now. She was the only person who would have tucked that card there. She had been in this bathroom recently enough to leave something of her father's memory hidden inside a folded towel. And she had hidden it, not placed it, not forgotten it, hidden it. I stood there in my hallway bathroom for a long moment with that small card in my hands and tried to understand what I was feeling, and what I felt was not worry exactly and not alarm exactly, but something quieter than both of those. I felt the particular helplessness of a mother who has been watching a door close and suddenly realizes she can hear the lock turning from the other side. I called Natalie that evening. She answered, which she had not always been doing recently, and she sounded careful, the way she always sounded careful with me now, like every sentence was something she had thought about once before saying. I asked her how she was doing, and she said she was fine. I asked her if she had been by the house recently, and she paused for just a moment, not long, just a breath's worth of space, and then said, yes, she had stopped by last week to drop something off when I was at my church group. I asked her if she had left anything behind, and she said she did not think so. I did not mention the card. I do not know exactly why. Something told me not to mention it yet. Something told me that if I named it directly, she would retreat further, and I could not afford to lose any more ground between us. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, with my decaf coffee going cold, and thought about the women I had known across my life who had disappeared into themselves before anyone noticed the pattern. My own mother had done it in her last years, not out of sadness exactly, but out of a combination of shame and pride and the belief that her difficulties were hers to carry alone. I had watched her carry things alone until the carrying broke her in places that never quite healed. I had told myself more than once that if I ever saw that same quality in my own children, I would not make the same mistake my mother's family made. I would not call it a phase. I would not respect the silence until it became permanent. I called David that night too, more casually, the way you check in without alarming. I asked him how things were going and slipped in a question about Natalie, whether he had talked to her lately. He said he had texted her a few weeks back, and she had responded normally. He asked why I was asking, and I said I was just being a mother, which made him laugh in that tired but fond way grown children laugh at mothers who worry. I did not push further. I wrote down the date that evening in the small spiral notebook I keep by the kitchen telephone. November 14th. Note tucked in upstairs bathroom towel. Natalie confirmed visit but did not mention card. Calls reduced to twice monthly. Less appetite at dinner. Leaving early, eyes elsewhere. I wrote it all down in plain, ordinary sentences because I had lived long enough to know that patterns only become visible when you start recording them. A single observation is a feeling. 12 observations written down over time become something you can point to and say, here, this is what I saw. I am going to tell you what happened at Thanksgiving before I tell you about the night of the bathroom, because Thanksgiving was where I began to understand that what I was watching was not simply Natalie going through a quiet season. It was something more specifically shaped, more precisely aimed, and it had a source that sat at my dining room table and ate 2 helpings of sweet potato casserole and complimented my cooking in that warm, easy way that I had always taken as simple decency. Colin arrived early that year. He had been arriving early to things more often lately, which I had registered without thinking much about it. He came in through the side door the way he always did, brought a bottle of sparkling cider and a dish of his late wife's cranberry relish recipe that he made every year because it had become a tradition. He helped me set up the extra folding chairs in the dining room, and we talked about the weather and the neighborhood and the new family that had moved in 2 doors down. He was easy company. He had always been easy company. Natalie arrived 40 minutes after Colin, and when she came in through the front door and saw him already there in the kitchen, something happened in her face that lasted less than a second. I would not have seen it if I had not been watching her so carefully already. It was not fear exactly, and it was not surprise exactly. It was more like a very quick internal adjustment, the kind a person makes when they walk into a room and realize they have to be different in it than they planned to be. She recovered immediately. She hugged me, said hello to Arthur's old chair at the head of the table, the way she always did when she came in, went through the kitchen and said hello to Colin in a perfectly normal voice that told me nothing at all on its surface. He responded warmly, called her by name the way he always did, asked how work was going. She said fine. She said things were busy. She moved to the other side of the kitchen island. I kept cooking. I watched the steam come off the green bean pot. I listened to the room. What I noticed, and what I wrote down later that evening after everyone had gone home, was that for the entire 4 hours of that Thanksgiving gathering, Natalie and Colin were never in the same part of the room at the same time. It was not obvious. It was not dramatic. It looked like two people moving around a family dinner the way people do, naturally, without thinking. But I am 77 years old, and I have watched enough people move through enough rooms to know the difference between coincidence and choreography. They were choreographing something. They both knew the pattern, and they were both maintaining it, just from different sides. I also noticed that every time Colin spoke to the whole table, every time he made a small joke or offered an observation, Natalie looked at her plate. Not pointedly. Not in a way anyone else would have remarked on. Just quietly. The way a person keeps their eyes down when they cannot trust what their face might do if it looked up. After dinner, while Patricia and David's kids were watching something on television in the living room, and Arthur, that is David, was in the backyard making phone calls, I found myself alone in the kitchen with Colin for about 10 minutes. He washed dishes the way he always had, without being asked, rolling up his sleeves, talking easily about nothing in particular. He mentioned that he had noticed Natalie seemed a little quiet lately. He said it in a perfectly concerned tone, the tone of someone who cares and is gently observing, and he said he hoped she was not going through anything difficult. I said I hoped so too. He said, "You know how Natalie can get sometimes." He said it warmly, almost fondly, like a man describing a niece's particular temperament. He said she goes inward when things are hard, and sometimes the kindest thing is to let her come back in her own time. He said Arthur, my Arthur, had always said the same thing about her. I said yes, that sounded like her. But inside that kitchen, while the steam rose off the soapy water and the television murmured in the next room, something small and cold settled in the center of my chest. Because what Colin had just done, quietly and kindly, and without raising his voice, was build a frame around my daughter before she had a chance to speak inside it. He had offered the family a version of Natalie that explained her distance, her quietness, her early departures. He had packaged her behavior as a personality trait rather than a response, and he had used my own husband's voice to do it. I did not say any of that. I handed him the dish towel and thanked him for helping. I kept my face ordinary. But I went upstairs after dessert, and I wrote down every word of that kitchen conversation in my little spiral notebook, dated and precise, because I had learned something in that 10 minutes that I could not yet name, but absolutely could not afford to forget. That evening, after the last car had pulled out of the driveway and I had turned off the porch light and stood in my empty kitchen in the quiet that always fills a house after a full day of family, I picked up the small prayer card from the kitchen counter where I had moved it from the bathroom. Raymond Allen Graham. I held it for a moment, and then I placed it in the front pocket of my spiral notebook, where I would find it again weeks later on a night when I would need it more than I knew. I want to pause here because this is one of those moments in a story where the listener might be feeling something shift. If you are still here with me, I want you to know I appreciate it more than I can easily say. Leave a comment telling me where you are watching from tonight. What time is it there? Morning or evening or the middle of the night? And if something in this story is already sitting with you, leave a like so I know this telling is reaching someone. Subscribe if you want to hear what happens next, because there is another story here every single day. Now let me keep going, because what happened in December changed everything. The first week of December, Natalie called on a Wednesday for the first time in nearly 3 months, and I could tell immediately that the call was not ordinary. There was a quality to her breathing on the line, a careful, controlled evenness that I associated with the way she sounded when she was about to say something that cost her something. I said her name, and she said mine back, and then there was a pause long enough to hold a small life in it. She said she was all right. She said she just wanted to hear my voice. She asked what I had made for dinner, and I told her split-pea soup with the good bread from the German bakery on Route 15. And she made a small sound that was almost a laugh, and then she was quiet again. I asked her if she was sleeping all right. She said she was a little tired. I asked her if she was eating. She said she was eating fine. I asked her very gently whether there was something on her mind that she might want to talk about sometime. There was a pause, a very long one. And then she said, "Not yet." She said it in a way that told me it was not a refusal. It was a timetable. She was telling me there was something to tell and that the telling was not ready yet, but it was coming. I said, "All right, sweetheart." I said I would be here whenever she was ready. She said she knew that. She said, "Thank you." We talked for another 10 minutes about nothing specific and then said goodnight. And after I hung up, I sat in Arthur's old armchair in the front room, and I felt something that I can only describe as a long grief that had been waiting for a door to open. I had been right that something was wrong. I had been right that something was building. And knowing I was right brought me no comfort at all, because being right about your child hurting is one of the lonelier things in this world. I opened my notebook and I wrote the date. December 7th. Natalie called, said not yet. Timetable in her voice, not refusal. She is coming towards something. I wrote that, and then I sat with it for a long time in the blue quiet of that winter evening, with the streetlight coming through the front curtains and the sound of the neighbor's car pulling into the driveway across the street. And I thought about all the things my daughter had never been able to say to me, and all the things I had never been able to make easy enough for her to say. And I asked Raymond, my Arthur Raymond, wherever he had gone, to put a hand on our girl's shoulder until she could find her way back to mine. I have learned something over these many years of watching and listening and making mistakes and trying again. I have learned that when a person we love goes quiet, our first instinct is often to fill the silence with our own anxiety, our own questions, our own needs. We ask too fast and press too hard, and the very person we are trying to reach goes further inward instead of closer. I was not always good at restraint. I had my own years of pushing when I should have waited and demanding answers when what was needed was a steady presence. But age gives you some things. It gave me the ability to sit with uncertainty longer than I ever could when I was young. It gave me the patience to write things down instead of always acting on them. And it gave me the understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing a mother can do is make herself a place safe enough for the truth to find its way home when it is ready. December moved through its ordinary rhythms. I decorated the front porch with the same wreath I had been using for 15 years. I attended the Christmas concert at the church. I made cookies with David's youngest when they came through on their way to his in-laws. I called Patricia on a Sunday and we talked about flights and timing for the holidays. And every few days I added a small note to my spiral notebook. Not because I was building a legal case or preparing for any kind of confrontation, but because I have lived long enough to know that what the mind holds loosely, the written page holds surely. And if there ever came a time when I needed to understand the shape of what had happened, I wanted to have the shape of it recorded in my own handwriting. Natalie came for Christmas Eve. She arrived at 4 p.m, alone. She had not brought Bertrand, which was unusual because she usually brought Bertrand at Christmas because she did not like to leave him overnight. She said he was staying with a neighbor. She seemed well enough on the surface, wore a green sweater I had not seen before, brought a bottle of sparkling grape juice and a tin of shortbread from the grocery, and sat at the kitchen table while I cooked, and told me about a project she had finished at work and a podcast she had been listening to about architectural history in post-war Germany. She sounded almost like herself. Almost. Colin was not there on Christmas Eve. He was spending the holiday with a cousin in Wilmington. I had not told Natalie that he was not coming, and I watched her shoulders settle very slightly when she arrived, and counted the cars on the street and understood that the house held only the two of us. We ate dinner together, just the two of us, at the small kitchen table instead of the big dining room table, which is what we always did when it was just us. It felt gentle and old-fashioned and right. We talked about Arthur. We talked about Patricia's garden in Arizona. We talked about a neighbor's house that had been sold and who might be moving in. We did not talk about whatever Natalie was carrying, but it was there the whole evening the way weather is there even on a clear day, present in some quality of the air. When she got up to leave around 9, she stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment in her coat and looked at me with an expression that I had not seen on her face since she was about 17 years old, standing in the doorway of her childhood bedroom and trying to decide whether to ask me something. Back then, she had decided not to, whatever it was. On this night, she looked at me for that same moment and then said goodnight and went out to her car. I stood at the front window and watched the taillights go down Fairmont Ridge Avenue, and then I went back to my kitchen and I cried quietly for about 5 minutes for all the things my daughter was carrying that I was not yet permitted to carry with her. And then I washed the dishes and went to bed. That was Christmas Eve. What happened in January was different. And what happened on that particular night in late January, the night of the bathroom, the night that Natalie's timetable finally ran out and the truth came through the door, that is what I have been working toward since I first told you about the prayer card and the folded towel. I am going to get there. But I want you to stay with me, because the story does not make its full meaning clear until you understand all the ground it crossed to arrive at that bathroom door. If you are still here, leave a like for this old woman. Tell me what time it is where you are. Subscribe for tomorrow's story. And if you have ever known someone who was going quiet in a way that could not be explained as simple tiredness, write the word "listen" in the comments. Because before this story is over, you will understand exactly why that word matters. January in Harrisburg is the month when the gray settles in and decides to stay a while. The trees are already stripped and have been for months, and the sky sits low and pale over the rooftops. And the cold is not dramatic, not the kind with heavy snow and drama, but the dull, persistent kind that gets into the baseboards and stays. I keep the thermostat at 68 and wear the old wool cardigan that was Arthur's, and I do not fight the gray because I have made my peace with it over the decades. The gray and I understand each other now. Natalie called on a Friday evening in the second week of January. She asked if she could come over on Saturday. She said she did not need anything specific, she just wanted to come by. She asked if anyone else would be there, and I said no, it would just be us. She said good. She said she would be there around 2 p.m. She said one more thing before she hung up. She said, "Mom, can you make the split pea soup, the one with the good bread?" I said of course I could. I hung up and stood in my kitchen and felt that same quality of coming weather I had felt at Christmas, but louder now, closer, like a front moving in rather than sitting in the distance. I made a pot of split pea soup on Saturday morning, and I picked up a fresh loaf from the German bakery on Route 15, and at 1:30 I was sitting at the kitchen table with my notebook and my coffee when I heard Colin's car in the driveway. I want to be precise about this because precision matters when I tell the next part. Colin had not called ahead. He had not texted. He simply appeared, the way he had been appearing more often in recent months, with a container of something from his kitchen and a reason that was reasonable and a smile that I had never had cause to question. He said he had made too much chicken and rice and thought I might want some. He said he was just dropping it off and would not stay, and then he sat down at the kitchen table. I offered him coffee because I am the kind of woman who offers people coffee, and I did not yet have a reason to be otherwise. He accepted. We talked. He asked if anyone was coming by, and I said Natalie was coming this afternoon. Something moved through his expression. Not alarm, not precisely. More like a recalibration, the same kind of rapid adjustment I had seen in Natalie's face at Thanksgiving, but quieter, more controlled, the version of it that belongs to a man who has practiced composure. He said that was nice. He said he hoped she was doing better. I said I thought she was, and I poured his coffee, And I sat down across from him, and I thought very clearly and very quietly to myself, he knows something. And whatever he knows, it has the same shape as whatever Natalie has been carrying for months. And those two knowledges did not come from different places. I have learned that sometimes understanding arrives before proof does. The mind assembles a picture before the evidence finishes arriving. I am not a woman who acts on feeling alone, which is why I have my notebook and why I have spent months writing things down instead of asking questions I was not ready to hear the answers to. But sitting at that kitchen table with Colin's coffee cup in front of him and the split pea soup on the stove and the clock moving toward 2 p.m, I felt the shape of something become suddenly and undeniably clear. At 2:10, Natalie's car turned into the driveway. I watched Colin through the kitchen window as I heard her car door close. He did not move. He simply wrapped both hands around his coffee mug and looked at the table. Natalie came through the front door and walked down the hall and into the kitchen doorway and stopped. She saw him. The stop was invisible to anyone who had not been watching her for months. It lasted less than 1 full second. Then she came in and said hello to him and hello to me, and put her coat on the hook and stood at the counter and asked if she could have coffee. I said of course, and I watched them both while I poured. We sat together at the kitchen table for 45 minutes, the three of us, and the conversation was ordinary. It was winter and jobs and a news story about a local road closure. It was perfectly, seamlessly ordinary. And underneath the ordinary surface of it, I could feel the enormous invisible pressure of two people managing the same secret from opposite sides of a table while a 77-year-old woman poured the coffee and pretended not to notice. Colin left at 3:10. He stood, thanked me for the coffee, put on his coat, said goodbye to Natalie with a warmth that was precisely the right temperature for a family friend and nothing else, and went out the side door. I heard his car start. I heard it back out of the driveway. I heard it go. Natalie and I sat quietly for a moment. I could hear the soup on the stove. I could hear the wind against the kitchen window. I could hear her breathing in that careful, controlled way that I had come to know well. She looked at her coffee cup. She said, "Mom." I said, "I am right here, sweetheart." She stood up from the table, and she looked at me with those dark, serious eyes, and she said, "Can you come upstairs with me for a minute?" I said yes. We walked upstairs together, past the framed photographs in the stairway, past Arthur's old study with the door closed, down the hallway to the bathroom. She pushed the door open and went inside, and I followed, and she closed the door behind us, and the two of us stood in that small white bathroom that smelled of lavender soap and the particular stillness of a winter afternoon. She reached into the pocket of her sweater and placed something on the edge of the sink, and that was the moment everything changed. I want to tell you exactly what I saw resting on the white porcelain edge of that sink, because it is a detail I have replayed in my mind more times than I can count in the months since that afternoon. It was a small, rectangular object, white and pale blue, the kind of thing you can buy at any pharmacy, the kind of thing that carries inside it a result that cannot be negotiated with or argued into a different shape. A pregnancy test, and it had 2 lines. I am going to be honest with you about what I felt in that first instant. I felt something that I am not entirely proud of, which was the instinct to find an explanation that would take the fear away. Mothers do this. We are sometimes so committed to protecting our children from the worst versions of their circumstances that we leap toward any interpretation that costs less. I looked at those 2 lines and I thought for one very small moment of a boyfriend I did not know about, someone new and possible, a story that would be surprising but uncomplicated. I held on to that version for the length of one breath. Then I looked at my daughter's face. Natalie was not frightened the way a woman is frightened when she is about to share surprising news with her mother. She was frightened the way a person is frightened when they have been carrying a secret that has been eating them from the inside and they are finally releasing it, and they do not know whether the release will save them or simply expose them to something worse. There is a difference in those 2 kinds of fear. I had raised 3 children and buried a husband. I knew the difference. I reached out and I took both of her hands in mine. She let me. Her hands were cold. I said, "Tell me what is happening, sweetheart." I said it very quietly. She did not speak right away. She looked at the wall above the sink, at the small framed print that has hung there for 20 years, the one with the barn and the autumn field, and she breathed the way people breathe when they are trying to gather themselves into the shape of the words they need to say. Then she said, "Mom, I need to tell you who the father is." I did not say anything. I waited. She said his name. She said Colin. I have tried many times in the months since that afternoon to accurately describe what happened inside me when I heard that name spoken in that bathroom. It was not a collapse exactly, and it was not a shock exactly, although both of those things were present. It was more like the ground under a familiar house suddenly revealing itself to have been made of something different than what you thought, and the house is still standing, but your understanding of what has been holding it up has changed completely. I sat down on the closed toilet lid because I needed to sit down, and there was nowhere else to sit, and the cold porcelain of that small bathroom and the lavender soap smell and the faint sound of the soup still going on the stove downstairs, all of it became very precise and very close in the way that the ordinary world becomes precise when something extraordinary has moved through it. Natalie sat down on the edge of the bathtub across from me. We were very close together in that small room. She had her hands in her lap, and she was looking at me with an expression that I can only describe as the face of a person braced for impact. I said her name. She said, "I know." I said, "How long, Ed?" She said it had begun about a year earlier, in a period that she described as a very hard one. Arthur, her father Arthur, had been gone about 3 years by then. She said she had been struggling in ways that she had not shown anyone, and that Colin had been present in those months in a way that felt at first like simple kindness. She said she knew I would not want to hear certain things. She said she was not trying to make excuses or assign blame in ways that were not clean. She said she had been a grown woman who had made choices, and she needed me to understand that, and she needed me not to look at her like she was a child who had been tricked. I listened. I held her hands, and I listened, and I did not say the things that were forming in my chest, the things about his age and his position, and the years of trust, and the kitchen table conversations, and the way he had just been sitting in my home 40 minutes ago, wrapping his hands around a coffee cup and saying things were nice. I did not say any of it, because what Natalie needed in that first moment was not my anger. My anger was not her emergency. She said that for a period of several months, she had believed the relationship was something it turned out not to be. She said he had spoken about her in terms that felt like commitment, like a private understanding between two people who were building towards something real. She said she had not told anyone because he had told her it needed to be private for now, that the family would need time, that rushing the telling would only complicate things. She said she had told herself those reasons were reasonable, and then gradually, across many months, she had come to understand that private did not mean protected. It meant hidden, and hidden did not mean waiting to be revealed. It meant never. She said that when she had tried, gently, to move toward something more honest, toward telling me, toward asking what this actually was, he had responded not with anger, but with something more careful than anger. He had begun, over weeks and months, to speak about her to the family in ways that made her sound unstable, tired, going through something, difficult. He had done it lovingly. He had done it with concern in his voice. He had built a version of Natalie for my eyes, for David's ears, for Patricia's texts, that explained everything she might eventually say as a symptom of her fragility, rather than as information to be believed. I have learned many things in 77 years about the way harm works inside families. I have learned that the most effective harm is almost never the dramatic kind. It does not arrive with cruelty or ugliness. It arrives in the form of concern. It arrives as explanation. It arrives as a man at a Thanksgiving table saying, "You know how Natalie can get sometimes," in a fond voice, over dish soap and hot water. using a dead man's observation to build a wall around his own secret. Natalie had not been disappearing because she was fragile. She had been disappearing because she was trying to find a way to exist in a story that had been written for her without her consent, and every time she came close to the edge of telling the truth, she could see that the framework for dismissing her had already been laid. I want to pause in the middle of all of this because I need you to understand something about what I am telling you and why I am telling it this way. I am not telling you this as a case study or a lesson with clean edges. I am telling you this because I sat on a closed toilet lid in my own hallway bathroom and understood, fully and without the mercy of confusion, that I had been used as an instrument in my own daughter's isolation. Not knowingly, not cruelly on my part, but fully nonetheless. I had accepted a version of my daughter from the same mouth that had been building walls around her. And for the months that I had been watching and noting and writing things down and trusting my instincts, I had not looked clearly enough at the source of the narrative I was receiving. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to stop here and ask you something. If you have ever trusted someone completely and then learned that the trust was a door that had been used to walk through your house without asking, you know the particular quality of that discovery. If you know that feeling, write the word believe in the comments. And if you are listening from somewhere far away, tell me where. Tell me what time it is. If this story is asking something of you, leave a like. Subscribe for tomorrow's story because there is one here every day, and tomorrow's story will carry something of its own. Now let me go back to that bathroom. Natalie had been 30 years old when this began. She was a grown woman, clear-minded and capable, not a child who was confused about the world. I want to say that plainly because what she had experienced was not the confusion of youth or the naivety of inexperience. It was something that can happen to any adult who is grieving and isolated, and therefore more open to comfort from familiar sources. Grief makes us permeable. It makes the people who already know our wounds more dangerous than strangers, not because they necessarily intend harm, but because they already have the key to the places we most need to protect. She had lost her father. She had been living alone. She had been managing a kind of sorrow that she had not let herself fully process because she was, as she always had been, Natalie, who kept things together and did not make a fuss. And into that landscape of private grief had come someone who knew her family, who knew her history, who knew what her father had meant to her, and who could speak his name with the authority of someone who had been present for years. I am not telling you this to explain away the choices she made. She told me herself that she did not want that. What I am telling you is the context that my notebook did not contain, the context that explained not just the changes I had been observing, but the origin of those changes. Because I had been watching my daughter disappear, and I had attributed it to something unnamed and interior. What was actually happening was far more specific. She had been trying to manage an impossible situation without the vocabulary to name it and without the confidence that naming it would be believed. That last part is what took my breath away as I sat on that closed toilet lid in the cold lavender air of the second-floor bathroom. Not that she had been afraid to speak, but that she had been afraid she would not be believed. By me. By her mother, sitting 3 miles away in a house that had her father's chair at the head of the table and her childhood photographs on the stairway wall and split pea soup on the stove on Saturday afternoons. She had been afraid that when she finally said the words, I would look at her the way I had looked at her in recent months, with a concern that had been, at least partly, shaped by someone else's hands. The prayer card. I thought of the prayer card the moment I thought of this. She had come to this house when she thought I was not home, and she had gone upstairs to the hallway bathroom, and she had tucked her father's name inside a folded towel on the shelf. I did not know yet exactly why she had done that, or what it meant to her specifically, but I felt the shape of it. She had come to her parents' house. She had gone to the place where her father's memory lived, in the act of a folded towel and a familiar shelf. She had left a small piece of the truth of where she was before she could say it out loud. I have thought about that act many times since January. I have thought about what it means when someone leaves a piece of their situation, somewhere they trust, before they can fully carry it into the open. It is not a cry for help in the dramatic sense. It is not even necessarily conscious. It is the self doing something the voice cannot yet do, placing a small piece of the truth somewhere safe until the rest of the truth is ready to follow. My daughter is not a woman who cries easily. She never has been. She cried at bird documentaries as a small child, and she cried at her father's bedside in those last days, and she cried in that bathroom, the two of us sitting 3 feet apart in the winter quiet, and it was the kind of crying that comes after holding something for too long. The relief of a hand finally opening. The ache of muscles that have been clenched against a weight for months on end. I moved from the toilet lid to sit beside her on the edge of the bathtub. It was not comfortable. I am 77 and my hips have opinions about cold porcelain. But I sat beside her and I put my arm around her and I said nothing, because there are moments when a mother speaking out loud is less than a mother present, and this was one of those moments. I let her cry. I kept my arm around her. I listened to the soup on the stove and the wind and the silence of a winter afternoon in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. When she finally could speak again, she said, "I am sorry I did not tell you sooner." I said, "Sweetheart, there is nothing to apologize for." She said, "I was afraid you would not believe me." I said, "I believe you." I said it clearly, without qualification, without but or however, or let me just understand the full situation first. I said it the way I should have made it possible for her to know all along, plain and immediate and without conditions. She put her head on my shoulder. I held her. I want to tell you what I understand now about that moment and about what my daughter had been living through, because there is something in it that I think is important and that I do not want to pass over in favor of what happened next. There is a particular kind of silence that grows around a person when the story about them is being written by someone else. I have seen it in elderly neighbors who were called confused when they were simply scared. I have seen it in grandchildren who were called dramatic when they were actually hurting. I have seen it in women my own age who were told they were overreacting when they were the only ones in the room paying close enough attention to react at all. The silence is not weakness. It is the weight of a narrative that someone else is holding over you, and it is very difficult to speak clearly beneath that kind of weight. My daughter had been trying to speak for months. She had been speaking the only way she could manage while the louder version of her was being constructed for us by someone sitting at our table. And it had taken months of careful watching, a prayer card in a bathroom towel, split pea soup on a January afternoon, and the courage of a 31-year-old woman finally putting a small white object on the edge of a sink to bring us to the truth. None of that happened because anyone was dramatic or unstable or difficult. It happened because someone had decided that Natalie's silence was more convenient than her voice. I thought of all the notes in my spiral notebook, the dates and the observations and the small moments that had not yet connected into a clear picture. I thought of the Thanksgiving conversation in my kitchen, of those warm, careful words about letting Natalie come back in her own time, of my dead husband's name used like a hand pressed gently on a door to keep it closed. And I felt something that I can only describe as the particular grief of a woman who trusted her own perception and still did not move fast enough. Not because she was foolish, but because the performance had been good, and because she had been taught, across decades of ordinary life, that men like Colin were what kindness looked like. I had to unlearn something in that bathroom. I had to unlearn the assumption that a man who is gentle in public is necessarily safe in private. I had to unlearn the habit of measuring concern by whether it is delivered with a raised voice or a quiet one. I had to accept that the most sustained harm can be nearly invisible from the outside and can operate through the mechanism of care itself, through the appearance of being the one who is helping, through the vocabulary of concern that functions as a lock on a door. I said to Natalie, while we sat on the edge of that bathtub, that I needed to ask her one thing, and she could take as long as she needed to answer it. I said, "What do you need from me right now, today, in this minute?" She thought about it for a long time. She said, "I need you not to go downstairs and call him." I said I would not. She said, "I need you not to tell anyone tonight." I said I would not. She said, "I need you to just be my mother for a little while before this becomes everything else." I said, "I am your mother. I am right here. Everything else can wait." And I meant it. I meant every word of it. Because I had made enough mistakes across the months of watching and waiting and accepting versions of my daughter that had been handed to me rather than earned by me. I was not going to make any more of them. Not in that bathroom. Not on that January afternoon. Not with my daughter sitting beside me on the edge of the bathtub with her head beginning to lift and her breathing beginning to steady and the soup still going on the stove downstairs. What I did not tell her in that moment, what I kept to myself because it was mine to carry for now, was that I already understood several things that were going to matter very much in the weeks ahead. I understood that the months of observation and documentation had not been wasted. I understood that the conversations at family dinners and the careful noting of dates and changes and the single prayer card now living in the front pocket of my spiral notebook were not the scattered worries of an anxious old woman. They were the architecture of a truth that was going to need to be built carefully and patiently, and without the kind of recklessness that would cost my daughter more than it cost anyone else. I understood that a woman of 77 with a notebook, a memory, and a very good reason to pay attention was not without resources. And I understood, sitting there in the quiet bathroom while the winter afternoon went on around us outside the window, that the split pea soup with the good bread from the German bakery was still warm on the stove, that we were going to go downstairs in a little while and sit at the kitchen table in the quiet of the house and eat together, that my daughter had come home, not completely, not without complications, not without the hard months of work that still lay ahead. But she had come through the door. She had said the name. She had put her head on my shoulder. The door was open. I want to pause right here one more time before I tell you what came next, because what I'm about to tell you in the next part of this story is the part where easy things stop and real things begin. Before I take you there, I want to ask you this. If you have ever been the person sitting beside someone who finally said the thing they had been carrying, and you understood in that moment that your job was not to fix it or react to it, but simply to receive it, write the word receive in the comments. That kind of presence is one of the most important things a person can offer someone they love. Leave a like if this story is reaching you. Subscribe for tomorrow because I will be here with another story, and someone in your life might need you to know what this kind of quiet courage looks like. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me what time it is there. And stay with me, because there is still much more to tell. What happened in the weeks that followed is what I need you to understand before anything else, because the months of careful watching and writing things down were about to become necessary in ways I had not yet fully anticipated. The soup was still warm when we came downstairs. The days that followed that Saturday in January moved with a particular slowness that I have come to associate with the period after a truth has been spoken, but before anything has been done about it. It is a strange in-between time those days. The world looks ordinary from the outside. The street looks the same. The kitchen smells the same. The neighbor's dog still barks at the mail carrier every morning at 9:10. But inside the house, inside the person who is holding the new knowledge, everything has rearranged itself around a different center. And the rearrangement takes time to settle into something you can act from rather than simply react to. Natalie stayed for dinner that Saturday. We ate the split pea soup together at the small kitchen table, just the two of us, with the good bread from the German bakery and the quiet of the winter afternoon going on outside the windows. We did not talk about Colin again that evening, not directly. We talked about the soup. We talked about the bread. We talked about a film she had seen recently that she thought I might like. We talked around the edges of the enormous thing that had been placed in the center of the room, and that was all right. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do after a truth has finally come out is to let it breathe without immediately reaching for it. Before she left, she stood at the side door in her coat and scarf and looked at me with those serious, dark eyes and said, I am not ready for anything to happen yet. She said it clearly, like a woman who had spent time deciding how to say it. She said she needed a few weeks to understand what she was thinking and what she wanted to do and how she wanted to do it. She said she was not asking me to do nothing forever. She was asking me to do nothing yet. I said, I understood. She said, Mom, I mean it. Nothing yet. I said, Natalie, I hear you. I said it with my eyes and my hands as much as my words. I said, you lead this. I will follow when you are ready. She hugged me then, a long, solid hug, the kind she had not given me in over a year, the kind that has actual weight in it. And then she went out to her car, and I watched the taillights go down Fairmont Ridge Avenue one more time. And this time, the watching felt different. It felt less like watching someone disappear and more like watching someone find their way back to a road they had stepped off of for too long. I went back to my kitchen table and I opened the spiral notebook to a clean page, and I wrote the date. January 19th. Natalie told me. She is asking for time. She is leading. I am following. And then I sat for a while and thought about what following would look like and what patience would cost me and whether I was truly capable of the restraint I had promised her. I have to be honest with you about something. I am not a woman who is naturally patient when someone I love is hurting. I am the kind of woman who moves toward the trouble, who wants to organize and document and confront and resolve. I get that quality from my own mother, who was a woman of fierce forward energy that served her well in some circumstances and cost her dearly in others. I had spent most of my parenting years learning to moderate that quality, to use it when it was needed and hold it back when it was not. But there had always been a cost to the holding back. And in the days after Natalie's confession, the holding back cost me considerably. Because Colin called on Monday. He called my home number, which he had always done, and he left a voicemail in that easy, warm voice that I had trusted for 12 years, saying he hoped I was well and that he had been thinking about stopping by later in the week if I was up for company, and that he had noticed Natalie seeming a little better on Saturday and was glad to see it, and that he hoped the soup had been good. I stood in my kitchen listening to that voicemail 3 times. He had noticed Natalie seeming a little better on Saturday. He had been in my house on Saturday. He had sat at my table for 45 minutes while my daughter sat 3 feet from him, carrying everything she had just carried for the past year. And he had gone home and 3 days later called to mention, warmly and with concern in his voice, that he had noticed she was doing a little better. I did not call him back. I wrote down the exact words of his voicemail in my notebook, dated and as close to verbatim as I could manage. And then I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold, and I thought about all the ways that a man who is managing a secret can use the language of care as camouflage. Every time he had spoken about Natalie to me or to the family, the words had sounded like kindness. The vocabulary had been the vocabulary of someone who cared, but what the words had actually been doing was something else. They had been placing a frame around her. They had been constructing an interpretation of her behavior that the rest of us would carry into any conversation we had with her, any observation we made about her, any question we formed about what was wrong. I have lived long enough to understand that the most dangerous kind of narrative is not the one that is obviously cruel. It is the one that sounds like love. Because cruel narratives are visible, they can be argued with, they can be rejected. But a narrative delivered in the vocabulary of care and concern, by someone the family has trusted for over a decade, from a position of warmth and helpfulness, that kind of narrative goes into the house the way a quiet draft goes through a doorframe. You do not notice it until the room has already grown cold. I want to stop here and talk to you for a moment, because this is one of those places in a story where I always hope the listener is sitting with something useful rather than simply sitting with something sad. If you have ever been in a situation where your read on a person was slowly reshaped by another person's commentary, you know what I am describing. It does not require dramatic events. It requires only repetition. It requires only the steady, gentle insistence of a narrative offered by someone you trust. And once that narrative has settled in, it is very difficult to question, because questioning it means questioning the trust you placed in the person who delivered it. What I did not do in those days was act from anger. I know that might surprise some of you, because the anger was there. It was absolutely present. It lived in my chest like something with heat and weight. But I had been raising children and watching families for over 50 years, and I understood with the clarity that comes from all that watching that anger acted upon too quickly becomes the story. If I had called Colin that Monday and said what I knew, the story would have immediately become about me. About the elderly mother who had overreacted. About the grandmother who had been told one side of a difficult situation and had gone off in a rage. That story would have cost Natalie everything she had finally found the courage to say. So I did not act from anger. I acted from patience and documentation and the steady, quiet knowledge that I was not without resources, and that time, used carefully, was on my daughter's side rather than against it. I want you to know something, and I want you to hold on to it. If you are ever the person in this situation, the mother or the father or the grandmother or the aunt or the friend, and you know something that has weight to it, and you are trying to figure out what to do with what you know, the most important thing I can tell you is this: write it down. Write down the dates. Write down the exact words people say. Write down the behaviors you observe. Write down the sequence of events. Not because you are building a legal case, although sometimes that becomes necessary, but because documentation is the antidote to a narrative that is being built against you. A handwritten record of what you actually saw and heard, dated and consistent and specific, is one of the most powerful things a careful person can hold on to. Before I tell you about the weeks that followed, I need to ask you something. Where are you right now? What city? What country? What time is it where you are? I like knowing these things because it reminds me that this story is going somewhere beyond my kitchen table in Harrisburg, that someone in a different time zone with a different winter or a different season is sitting with something that matters to me. Leave a like if this story is giving you something to think about. Subscribe if you want another story tomorrow. There is one here every day, and some days the story is yours before you even know you needed it. Write the Word document in the comments if you have ever started keeping track of something because your instincts told you it mattered. Now let me keep going. Natalie and I began talking more regularly in the weeks after January. Not long calls, not dramatic conversations. Short, steady, checking-in calls, the kind we should have been having for years. She was doing a great deal of internal work in those weeks. I could hear it in her voice. She was seeing a counselor, a woman she had found herself, someone she trusted. She told me she was going to appointments regularly and that she was not ready to tell me much about what they talked about, only that it was helping. She said she was sleeping a little better. She said Bertrand had started sitting on her bed at night again, instead of in the doorway, which she said probably meant something, even if she was not sure what. I kept my promise. I did not call Colin back. I was unavailable in various ordinary ways when he made attempts to stop by. I was at the church group. I was at a doctor's appointment. I was not feeling well enough for company. I did not slam a door or send a signal. I simply became, gradually and naturally, less available because I had learned from watching how it was done that the quietest moves are sometimes the most effective ones. My neighbor, Dottie Hargrove, who is 69 and has lived across the street from me for 22 years, came over in the third week of January with a tray of lemon bars and the kind of expression that told me she had something on her mind. Dottie and I have the kind of friendship that middle-aged women build slowly across years of shared porches and borrowed eggs and the occasional honest conversation that neither of us has with anyone else. She sat at my kitchen table, and she ate a lemon bar, and she asked me if I was all right, because she said I had seemed like I was carrying something. I said I was fine. She said she had noticed that Colin had not been around as much lately. I said yes, things had been busy. She looked at me for a moment, with the particular perception of a woman who has known you long enough to know when you are giving her the polite version. Then she said, "Loretta, I want to tell you something, and you do not have to respond to it." She said that last fall, sometime around October, she had seen Colin's car in my driveway late on a Thursday evening when she knew I was at my church women's group. She had not thought much of it at the time because he was always around, and she had assumed I had given him a key for practical purposes. But she had mentioned it to her husband at the time, and her husband had asked her about it recently when he noticed Colin had stopped coming around, and the combination of the two things had been sitting with her. I looked at my neighbor, Dottie Hargrove, across my kitchen table. I thought about how a detail like that, a car in a driveway on a Thursday evening in October, was exactly the kind of thing that a spiral notebook was built to hold. I said, "Dottie, would you be willing to write down what you remember about that evening? As specifically as you can. The date if you can narrow it, the time approximately, what you saw." She looked at me steadily and said, "Is everything all right?" I said that I believed it would be, and that I would explain more when I was able to, but that her writing it down would matter. She said she would. She took a lemon bar for the road, and she went back across the street, and the next morning she came back with a folded piece of lined paper that said, in her neat handwriting, approximately October 16th or 17th, Thursday evening, around 7:15, Colin's gray sedan parked in Loretta's driveway. Lights on upstairs. No other cars present. I added it to my notebook, and I wrote Dottie Hargrove's name next to it and the date she gave it to me. And I thought about the way evidence is rarely dramatic. It does not often arrive as a single decisive revelation. It arrives in pieces, in neighbor observations and voicemail messages and prayer cards, in folded towels, and the careful accumulation of things that were always there but had not yet been gathered into the same place. In the 4th week of January, I called my son David. Not to tell him everything, not yet, but to have a conversation that I needed to have carefully and without alarming him before I was ready for the next phase of what was happening. I told him that I had been worried about Natalie and that my worry had become more specific and that I was hoping we could talk soon in person. He heard the change in my tone because children always hear the change in their mother's tone even when they are 44 years old and living in Pittsburgh. He said he would come up in 2 weeks. I said good. I said thank you. I said to please not mention to anyone that we were planning to talk. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mom, how serious is this?" I said, "Serious enough that I have been writing things down for months." He did not say anything else on that topic. He just said, "I will come February 8th. February 8th, I wrote it in the notebook. David. February 8th. And I thought about what I would say and how I would say it and what I would need him to understand before he could be useful to Natalie rather than a complication to what she was navigating. In the meantime, Natalie was moving through her own process and I was learning to follow rather than lead, which was one of the hardest things I have done as a mother. She called on a Thursday evening in late January and she said something that I wrote down word for word because it deserved to be preserved. She said, "Mom, I have been thinking about why I stayed quiet so long, and I think part of it was that I had already heard myself described so many times through someone else's words that I stopped trusting my own." She said, "I knew what I had experienced. I knew what had happened and what had been said and what had been promised and what had been taken away. But I had heard myself described as fragile and unstable and going through a phase so many times from a source that everyone trusted that I started wondering if maybe I was the problem." I held the phone very tightly when she said that. She said, and then I would think, if I say something and everyone has already been told I am unreliable, who will they believe? I said, "Natalie, I believe you." I said it again. I said it a third time. Not because I thought repetition was magic, but because she had been going without it for so long that I wanted her to feel the weight of it landing rather than passing through. She said, "I know that now, Mom. I know. I want to tell you what I understand about what my daughter described, because I think it is one of the most important things in this entire story, and I do not want it to pass without the attention it deserves. When a person's credibility is slowly undermined over time, through patient and repeated narrative, through the gentle insistence that they are fragile or dramatic, or going through something, what happens to them is not simply that other people stop believing them. What happens is that they stop fully believing themselves. They begin to measure their own perceptions through the lens that has been provided for them. They begin to ask themselves, before they even open their mouth to speak, whether they will sound like the version of themselves that has been described. And that self-doubt is one of the most effective silencing mechanisms I have ever witnessed, because it requires no threat. It requires no raised voice. It operates entirely within the person, using materials that someone else placed there. That is what had been done to my daughter. Not with cruelty, not with visible harm. With patient, careful, affectionate narrative management delivered over many months through a voice that the family trusted and that she had once trusted. And the result was a 31-year-old woman who sat in a bathroom in January and had to gather herself to say a name because part of her was still waiting to hear herself described as confused. I have known grandmothers who were dismissed for years by their families and called forgetful, overdramatic, living in the past, because the person managing the narrative in their family had a reason to keep them quiet. I have known children who were called difficult and attention-seeking by adults who had a reason to keep them from speaking. I have known elderly neighbors who were called paranoid by people who were quietly making decisions about their finances or their living arrangements. And in every case, the person being dismissed had been right. They had been seeing clearly. The problem was not their perception. The problem was who controlled the language used to describe them. This is the lesson I want you to carry from this part of the story. Before you call someone dramatic or fragile or difficult or going through a phase, ask yourself who is giving you that description and what that person gains from your accepting it. I need to take a breath here and check in with you. If you are still listening, if this story is reaching into something real for you, I want to know about it. Leave a comment telling me where you are watching from tonight. What city, what state, what country, and what time is it there? Is it early morning or late at night or the middle of a quiet afternoon? I read those comments the way I used to read letters, one by one, slowly. If this story is giving you something you needed, leave a like. Subscribe for tomorrow, because there is a story here every day, and some of them will find you at exactly the right moment. Now let me tell you about the February meeting, because that is where the pieces began to come together. David arrived on February 8th, as promised, on a Friday afternoon, driving up from Pittsburgh in the gray winter light. He is a big, quiet man, my David, broad in the shoulders the way his father was, and careful with his words in the way that means he thinks before he speaks rather than after. He arrived with a bag of groceries from a market he had stopped at on the way, which is his way of saying he loves me without saying it, and we sat at the kitchen table and I made coffee and I told him what I knew. I told him carefully and in order. I told him about the Wednesday phone calls thinning out, the appetite at dinners, the early departures, the way her eyes had started going elsewhere when I spoke. I told him about the Thanksgiving conversation in the kitchen with Colin, the exact words, the warm, careful framing of Natalie as someone who just needed space and time, the use of his father's observation. I told him about the prayer card and the bathroom towel. I told him about Christmas Eve and the way her shoulders had settled when she counted the cars and understood Colin was not there. I told him about the voicemail after January 19th. I told him about Dottie Hargrove's folded piece of lined paper. I showed him the notebook. He read through it quietly, page by page, with the same careful attention he gave everything. I watched him read, and I watched his face, and I did not say anything while he was reading because I wanted him to form his own understanding from the documented record rather than from my interpretation of it. When he was finished, he closed the notebook and set it on the table and sat for a long time with his hands flat on either side of it. He said, "How long have you known about Natalie?" I said, 3 weeks. He said, "And you waited to call me." I said, "I promised her time." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Have you talked to Patricia?" I said, "Not yet." I said Natalie was going to lead that conversation when she was ready. He said, "Is she seeing anyone, a professional?" I said yes, she had found a counselor herself and was going regularly. He let out a long breath. He picked up his coffee cup and looked at the table. He said, "Mom, that man has been in our house for 12 years. I said, "I know." He said, "He sat at Dad's chair at Thanksgiving." I said, "I know." He said, and I believed him. I believed every single thing he said about Natalie. I thought she was having a rough patch. I thought she needed space. I texted her instead of calling because I did not want to crowd her. I said, "David." I said it gently. I said, "So did I." I said, "That is part of what I am telling you." We were given a story that made our ordinary concern into the wrong response. We were told to give her space precisely because space was what kept her quiet. And we gave it because it came from someone we trusted, in the vocabulary of care, and because it was easier than pushing through the distance. He looked at me. He said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "I need you to be steady." I said, "When Natalie is ready to have a larger conversation with the family, I need you to receive what she says the way I received it, without conditions or qualifications or the impulse to hear both sides before you decide whether to believe your sister." He said, "I believe her." I said, "I know you do." I said, "Say that to her when she is ready to hear it." He stayed for dinner that Friday. He slept in his old bedroom, and we had breakfast together on Saturday morning, and he drove back to Pittsburgh in the mid-morning gray. Before he left, he hugged me in the driveway and said, "You have been doing this alone for months." I said I had not been entirely alone. I had had the notebook. He laughed, a short, surprised laugh that was the first genuinely unguarded sound I had heard from him since he arrived. He said, "Dad would have said the same thing." I said, "Yes, he would have." I watched his car turn off Fairmont Ridge Avenue, and I went back inside and made my second cup of coffee and sat in Arthur's armchair in the front room for a while. The morning light came through the curtains at a low angle the way it does in February, thin and slanted and doing the best it can with limited resources, which felt like an honest description of most good things in winter. The following week I did something that I had been thinking about for some time. I called the pastor of our church, Reverend May Collier, who had known my family for 18 years and who had the particular quality of the best pastoral figures I have known, which is that she listened to difficult things without immediately trying to resolve them. I did not tell her everything. I told her that I was dealing with a family matter that required careful handling, and that I would appreciate her counsel, and that there was a member of the congregation involved in a way I could not yet fully explain. I asked her if she had a sense, from her own pastoral interactions, of Colin's character. Reverend May was quiet for a moment. She said, "Loretta, I want to be careful here, because I do not want to speak about anyone in ways that are not fair." I said I understood and appreciated that. She said, "What I can tell you is that there are times when a person presents one version of themselves to a community and lives another version privately. And when I have encountered those situations, they have sometimes become visible to me through the people on the receiving end of the private version." She said, "I am not saying anything specific. I am saying that if you have concerns, and it sounds to me like you have concerns that go beyond ordinary worry, I think it is worth taking those concerns seriously and speaking to appropriate people." I thanked her. I told her I would keep her informed when I was able to. I asked her to pray for my daughter without specifics, and she said she would. I added that conversation to my notebook. The date, the general content, the phrase she had used. I am not saying anything specific. Sometimes the most significant thing a careful person says is what they decline to say directly. What I want you to understand about this period, the weeks between January and early March, is that nothing dramatic happened during those weeks. There were no confrontations. There were no scenes. There were no revelations in crowded rooms or accusations over dinner tables. What happened was quieter and in many ways harder than drama. What happened was the slow, careful, patient building of a foundation, the kind that holds weight over time precisely because it was not rushed. Natalie was going to her counselor. She was sleeping better. She was eating better. She had called Bertrand her little gray supervisor one afternoon on the phone and laughed when she said it. A real laugh, the kind I had not heard from her in a year. Small things. But small things are the true measure of whether a person is beginning to find their way back to themselves. They are not dramatic. They do not announce themselves. They show up in the way someone says a cat's name on the telephone, and you understand for the first time in a long time that the voice on the other end is really there. Colin had made 3 more attempts to reach me since January. A voicemail. A knock at the side door on a Tuesday morning when I did not answer. A brief encounter at the pharmacy where I was polite and brief and told him I had been very busy and that we would catch up soon. He accepted each of these with the same warm understanding that had always been his characteristic presentation. I wrote down each encounter in the notebook. I wrote down exactly what he said and exactly what I said. I wrote down how he looked and whether his manner shifted at all when he did not receive the warm response he expected. I noted that his manner did not shift in any visible way. He remained what he had always appeared to be: warm, patient, easy, unconcerned. And I thought about what that consistency meant. Not about his guilt or his innocence, which were not mine to adjudicate, but about what it tells you when a person's external composure remains completely stable under circumstances where a genuinely innocent person with a genuine conscience might have begun to show some strain. I want to be very careful here, because I am not a judge, and this is not a courtroom, and I do not want to tell you that behavioral composure is evidence of anything conclusive. I am telling you what I observed, and what I wrote down, and what I thought about. I am telling you that I was a woman who had known this man for 12 years, and who was watching him for the first time through eyes that were not accepting the version of things he was offering. And what I saw was a man who was very good at being consistently himself, regardless of the pressures operating around him. That quality made me more careful, not less, because a person who panics is visible and manageable. A person who is composed under all conditions is something that requires a different kind of response. Before I tell you about March, about the morning I sat down with Natalie and her counselor, and the conversation that changed the shape of what came next, I want to stop and breathe with you for a moment. Because we are coming to the part of the story where all the careful months of watching and writing and waiting begin to move toward something. And I want to make sure you are still with me before we get there. If you are here, leave a like. Tell me in the comments what time it is, where you are, and where you are watching from. If this story has given you something to think about, whether about the people in your life who might be carrying something they cannot say yet, or about the narratives you have accepted about someone without questioning their source, tell me. Write the word steady in the comments if you believe that patience can be a form of courage. Subscribe if you want to hear the rest of this story tomorrow, because there is always more, and what comes next is the part where all the quiet groundwork finally finds its purpose. Now, let me take you to March. 6 months passed between that March afternoon in Constance Webb's office and the morning I am going to tell you about now. The morning that felt, for the first time in over a year, like the particular kind of ordinary that is earned rather than assumed. 6 months is not a long time in the history of a family. It is not long enough to heal everything or settle everything or resolve every complicated feeling into something clean and manageable. But it is long enough for certain things to become visible that were not visible before. Long enough for a person to begin sleeping through the night again. Long enough for a cat named Bertrand to move from the doorway back to the bed. Long enough for a daughter to call on a Wednesday evening and sound unmistakably like herself. I want to tell you what those 6 months looked like from the inside, because I think the inside of healing is something that stories like this one often skip over in favor of the resolution, the outcome, the moment where justice arrives and everything becomes clear. Real healing does not work that way. Real healing is not a destination you reach. It is a practice you take up, imperfectly and repeatedly, in the ordinary hours of ordinary days. It looks like soup on the stove and phone calls on Wednesday evenings, and a sister calling from Phoenix more often than she used to, It looks like a son who stops by on a Saturday in April just to have lunch and does not require an agenda for the visit. It looks like a mother who has stopped holding her breath every time the telephone rings. Natalie continued seeing Frances through those 6 months. She went every week through the spring and then every other week through the summer, and she told me, in the measured way that she had always talked about the things that mattered to her, that it was the most difficult and the most useful thing she had done for herself in years. She said there were sessions that left her exhausted in ways she had not anticipated, not because of anything Frances said, but because of things she found in herself when the space was quiet enough. She said she was learning to distinguish between the things she actually believed about herself and the things that had been placed there by someone else's repeated description of her. She said that distinction turned out to be harder to maintain than she had expected, that there were days when the placed version felt more real than the true version, and that the work was in returning to the true version again and again until it began to feel less like an argument and more like a home. I wrote that down. I did not write it in my spiral notebook, which had served its purpose and been closed. I wrote it on a small card that I put in the kitchen drawer where I keep the extra pens and the notepad for grocery lists, because I wanted it to be somewhere I would find it accidentally rather than intentionally. Somewhere it would catch me off guard on an ordinary Tuesday and remind me that the work of returning to yourself is something, like most important work, that you do over and over without fanfare. The legal and formal processes that Natalie had initiated moved with the particular slowness of things that are worth doing carefully. Constance Webb had told her at the outset to set her expectations for pace rather than speed, and Natalie had done that, and it had been the right preparation. There were conversations that had to happen, documented and witnessed. There were formal processes that required patience and the particular kind of courage that is not dramatic, but quiet and procedural and unglamorous. Natalie navigated all of it with a steadiness that I watched develop week by week, and which I understood was not natural to her in the way confidence is natural to some people, but was rather the result of work. The result of going to those sessions with Frances and learning that her account of her own life was not only valid, but worth the effort of standing behind. I am not going to tell you that everything resolved into a clean outcome, because it did not. The processes that Natalie initiated were ongoing. There were no dramatic courtroom moments. There was no single day on which everything was decided and delivered. What there was the slow accumulation of documentation reviewed and formal statements made and professional assessments completed, and the gradual construction of an accounting that had Natalie's voice at its center rather than someone else's version of her. Whether that process would ultimately produce the specific outcomes she was seeking, I could not tell you with certainty when the 6 months had passed, and I would not tell you with certainty now, because false certainty is a kindness I do not believe in. What I can tell you is that Natalie had a process. She had representation. She had documentation. She had a family standing behind her account of her own life. And she had herself, which was, in the end, the resource that had always mattered most and had been the last one she was able to access. Colin had become, by late summer, a person who no longer appeared in my driveway or in my voicemail or at my kitchen table. The removal of his presence from my daily life had a quality that I had not fully anticipated, which was that it revealed, in his absence, how much space he had occupied without my ever consciously giving it to him. I found myself in early summer standing in my kitchen at a time when he might previously have been sitting at my table, and noticing how quiet the house was, and understanding that the quiet was not empty but clear. There is a difference between a quiet that comes from absence and a quiet that comes from the removal of something that should not have been present. The first kind of quiet is loneliness. The second kind is something closer to integrity. My kitchen had the second kind. I called Reverend May Collier in July, not to report or to update, but because she had been holding a prayer for my daughter without knowing the specifics, and I felt she deserved to know that the prayer had found its purpose. I told her enough to let her understand that the situation had moved towards something more honest and that Natalie was in a process that was serving her. Reverend May said, "I want to tell you something, Loretta." She said, "I have known you for 18 years, and I have never seen you frightened by difficulty. But this year, I could see that you were frightened, and I could also see that you were not letting the fear make your decisions." She said, "That is a kind of faith that does not always get named as faith, but that is exactly what it is." I thought about that for a long time after I hung up. I thought about the relationship between fear and patience and faith, which I do not think are as separate as we sometimes present them. I think fear is the appropriate response to a real danger. I think patience is the discipline of not letting fear collapse into recklessness. And I think faith, whatever form it takes for a particular person, is the understanding that the ground beneath careful, loving action is not as unstable as it sometimes feels. It does not guarantee outcomes. It does not promise that everything will be resolved the way you hope, but it holds you upright long enough to do the necessary work. Dottie Hargrove and I had coffee on her porch on a warm evening in August. She had not asked me the full story, and I had not told her, but she knew enough. And we sat on her porch with our cups and watched the street go about its business, and she said, "I am glad you asked me to write it down." She said, "I almost did not do it." She said, "I thought maybe I was making something out of nothing." I said, "You were not." She said she had thought about that observation in her neat handwriting on a piece of lined paper many times since she wrote it, and had wondered whether writing it down had made a difference. I said it had. She said, "Good." She said, "I will remember that." She said, "Sometimes writing a thing down is the only way to keep it from disappearing." We sat there a while longer in the August evening and watched the neighbor's dog try to catch a moth under the streetlight, and it was a perfectly ordinary thing to watch. And the ordinariness of it was something I received with a gratitude that surprised me a little with its depth. Ordinary evenings are a luxury. I know that now more completely than I ever have. The quiet porch and the neighbor's dog and the cup going warm in your hands and the knowledge that the people you love are safer tonight than they were a year ago. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a great deal. In September, Natalie came for Sunday dinner for the first time since the previous year. Not a holiday, not a structured occasion, just Sunday dinner. She arrived in the late afternoon with Bertrand in his carrier and a bottle of sparkling grape juice and a look on her face that I had not seen since she was small, and coming through the door from somewhere she had been looking forward to coming home from. She put Bertrand's carrier down in the front room and opened it, and he walked out and surveyed my house with the specific proprietary inspection of a cat who has decided that a new territory is acceptable. And then he sat on the arm of Arthur's old chair and began washing his face with his paw, which is the most composed response to a new environment I have ever witnessed in any creature. I want to say something to parents who are raising children. Make yourself a place where the truth is received before it is judged. Make yourself a place where your child's account of their own experience is the starting point rather than the point you argue from. The children who are able to speak to their parents about the hardest things are not the children whose parents promised them there would be no consequences. They are the children whose parents made it clear, over years of ordinary conversation, that being believed was not a reward for behaving correctly. It was a given. Make it a given. And I want to say something to anyone who is sitting somewhere right now, perhaps late at night, perhaps in the early morning with a cup of coffee going cold, perhaps in the middle of an afternoon that feels like all the other afternoons, carrying something that you have not yet found a way to say. I want you to know that the door is out there. The house with the light on under the door is out there. The person who will receive what you are carrying without asking you to prove it first, that person is out there. You may need to find a counselor, a pastor, a neighbor with a porch, and a willingness to write things down on lined paper, an attorney who takes cases carefully, a sister who looks at flights before you have finished explaining. You may need more than one person. You may need time. But the telling is worth the time. The truth is worth the building. Your account of your own life is worth every careful brick. I have one more thing to tell you before I close. and it is about the prayer card. I found it again in September, the little laminated card with Raymond Allen Graham printed on one side and a verse from Psalms on the other. I had moved it from the spiral notebook into the kitchen drawer where I keep the extra pens, and I found it one morning in September when I was looking for a pen to write a grocery list. And I held it for a moment the way I had held it in November, in the upstairs bathroom, with a feeling in my chest that had no clean name. But the feeling was different now. In November, holding that card had meant standing outside a locked door in the dark and knowing someone was on the other side but not knowing how to reach her. In September, holding it meant something else entirely. It meant that my daughter had come to her parents' house in a difficult month and gone upstairs to a bathroom and left a small piece of her father's name in a folded towel, because that was the only way she had to say, "I am still here, I am still yours, I am coming back when I can." And she had come back. She had come back in January on a cold afternoon with a small white object on the edge of a sink. And she had come back in March with Francis and Constance and her own clear voice. And she had come back in September with Bertrand in his carrier and late summer tomatoes and a real laugh in my kitchen. She had come back. I put the prayer card back in the kitchen drawer, next to the grocery notepad. Not because I needed to keep it as evidence, because it had become something else now. It had become a small, laminated record of the moment when the door was still locked, but the light was already on, and someone on the other side was already planning her way through. My name is Loretta Graham. I am 77 years old. I live in a house on Fairmont Ridge Avenue in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where the afternoon light falls across the front porch in a way that my husband used to stop and stand in. He has been gone 4 years, and I still feel him in the light sometimes, and in the patient quality of a good soup, and in the serious dark eyes of the daughter who called him Raymond when she wanted to be tender with his memory. This year taught me more than any year I can remember in recent decades. It taught me that patience and documentation are forms of love that do not look like love from the outside. It taught me that the most dangerous narratives are delivered in warm voices. It taught me that belief, offered plainly and without conditions, is one of the most powerful things one person can give another. It taught me that my age is not a limitation on my perception. It taught me that a spiral notebook and a patient ear and the refusal to be replaced by someone else's version of my child are not small things. They are, in certain years, the most important things. And it taught me that the truth, built carefully and patiently from observation and documentation and the courage of one woman who finally put a small object on the edge of a sink, does not need to announce itself. It does not need to be dramatic. It only needs to be true. And the people who love you well enough to hold it, that is all the weight it needs to stand. I am so glad you stayed with me until the end. I mean that with all of me. If you listened to this story all the way through, you gave something real to this old woman's telling, and I want you to know that it was received with gratitude. Before we part today, I want to ask you one last time to tell me where you are. What city, what state, what country, what time is it there right now? Morning or evening or the quiet middle of the night when the house is still, and the people you love are sleeping and you are sitting with a story that asked something of you. I want to know. I always want to know. Leave it in the comments below. If this story moved you, leave a like. Not because I am asking for a favor, but because a like tells me that the telling reached someone, and that is the only reason I sit down to tell these stories in the first place. Subscribe if you want to come back tomorrow. There is a new story here every single day, and some days the story will find you at exactly the moment you needed it. That is not an accident. That is what happens when you show up for something regularly. The right things start finding you. Share this story with someone who might need it. Share it with a mother who is watching someone she loves go quiet and cannot name what she is seeing. Share it with a daughter who has been carrying something alone for too long. Share it with anyone who has ever been described by someone else before they had the chance to describe themselves. This story is for them. And if you truly listened today, if this story sat down beside you and asked you something about the people you love and how you receive them, And whether you are making yourself the safest door in the building, write the word seen in the comments. Just that one word, seen, because that is what this whole year was about. Being seen clearly, being seen truly, being seen by the person who loves you well enough to write things down, to wait, to keep the light on, and to receive the truth without conditions when it finally comes through the door. Take care of the people who trust you. Pay attention to the ones who are going quiet. Write things down. Make yourself a place where the truth is welcome before it is proven. And if someone you love is carrying something alone tonight, let them know that your door has the light on. From my kitchen table in Harrisburg to wherever you are sitting right now, thank you. From my heart to yours, take care.